In this segment, I'm going to discuss the structure of Iranian government, what I call the functional chart of Iran's government. By the time I be finished, it would be a combination of Byzantine, Rube Goldberg type of structure, complicated, but hopefully we could cut through that complication because we're going to be looking at each item separately, but at the end you'll understand what I mean when I said it's kind of Byzantine and very complicated. To begin with, what I've called the functional chart of Iran's dual government. The dual really has two different meanings here. One of them is the civilian institution versus the religious ones, which is going to be the topic of the first chart that I'm going to discuss today. The second meaning of it is elected versus unelected part of government. So that would be my second chart. So let me begin with the first chart about the focusing on the religious institutions versus the civilian ones. I'll begin with the civilian ones. Iran really does have three branches of government. There is the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary branch. If you note, the color of the judiciary is different from the other two branches. This is because I'm trying to underscore the fact that even though structurally you have three branches, the judiciary branch is really not part of the executive branch, at least as you associate it with the office of the presidency, and nor is it really truly a civilian institution. So to underscore that point, I've used a different color to depict it. So the civilian institutions are designated by that beige color, and we can begin first, of course, with the president. The president is elected for a 4-year term. He is limited, and I use the word he deliberately because it's really open to male population. It's limited to 2 consecutive terms. Re-election is possible if there is a period after your 2 consecutive terms. According to the Constitution, after the supreme leader, the president is the second highest ranking official and also the second most powerful official in the country. The president heads the executive branch and is responsible for ensuring the Constitution is implemented. And that said, however, I should point out that the Constitution sharply circumscribes the presidential powers. And it does so not just the presidential power. In fact, it circumscribes the entire executive branch, making them subordinate to the leader. To a lesser extent, the same is also true with respect to the parliament or majlis. President could be dismissed by the supreme leader if the president is found guilty by the Supreme Court or is impeached by the majlis, the parliament, guilty as a result of that impeachment. Even more importantly, it is the supreme leader, not the president as one normally would expect, who controls the armed forces and makes decisions on issues related to security, to defense, and every major foreign policy issues. This feature really makes Iran unique among all states in the world. In other words, normally you would expect the armed forces and this kind of a decision making about the foreign policy, security, and defense to be vested in the executive branch under the president, or in some systems the prime minister. But in the case of Iran, these are not the situation, and the power is given to the leader. Also, theocratic and clerical institution in Iran's power structure continuously and in a persistent way limit and check President's power. The next institution is the parliament. In Persian it's called the Majlis. It has 290 members. The numbers were increased after the revolution. And the Majlis is, at least in theory, is elected by the popular vote every 4 years. The last election was in March of 2012, and in this election the conservatives and hardliners further solidified their control and their earlier gains after 2004 and 2005 when Ahmadinejad became president. Now the Majlis is empowered with the usual parliamentary powers that you would expect. It's empowered to, of course, introduce laws, as well as to summon and impeach ministers and, of course, the president. However, parliamentary power of the Majlis is further checked as well by the religious institutions, and that check involves that all bills that have been passed by the Majlis, by the parliament, must be approved by another body, which we're going to discuss shortly. It's the Guardian Council, before those legislations can become law. The current Speaker of the Parliament is Ali Larijani. He is a rival of the current President Ahmadinejad, and he was a former nuclear negotiator which Ahmadinejad put aside when he got to power. So the cabinet, which is part of the executive branch, has to be approved. It's nominated by the president, but has to be approved by the Majlis or the parliament. Next is the judiciary. And the judiciary in Iran has a long history being under really clerical domination. So historically, Iran's judiciary never was truly independent branch and one that was immune from political influence. Until early 20th century, it was controlled by the clergy. The system later was in a big way secularized under the rule of Reza Shah in the early 1920s, around 1920s when he became the Shah. And then the trend in secularization of the judiciary continued under his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, until the revolution in 1979. After the revolution, the Supreme Court under the Islamic Republic revoked all previous laws that were deemed in their judgment to be un-Islamic, and these laws were replaced with Sharia laws based on Islamic text and teachings. There are several categories of courts operating under the judiciary system in Iran. The public courts handle both civil and criminal cases. And then there are the revolutionary courts, which are entirely a separate court system. The revolutionary courts are reserved for the anti-revolutionary activities ranging from national security endangerment as well as drug smuggling. So they cover a very broad areas of activities that are seen as threatening to the Islamic Republic. The special thing about the revolutionary court is that their verdicts is final. There are no appeal process. In other words, they're not subject to any appeal. Finally, there are special clerical courts. These clerical courts are mostly reserved for offenses and crimes committed by the clerics but on occasions you also see lay people tried by them. Like the revolutionary courts, the verdicts of these clerical courts are also final and not subject to any appeal. So that pretty much identifies the institutions in this system that I have called civilian institution. The next set of institutions that are designated by the green color are the religious institution. And the first one there is the head of the judiciary. So the head of the judiciary, overseeing the judiciary, is not part of the civilian institution. The head of the judiciary is appointed by the leader and not the president. And he reports directly to the leader. The head of the judiciary in turn appoints the head of the Supreme Court in the Islamic Republic, as well as the chief prosecutor. Furthermore, the head of the judiciary also ends up nominating 6 lay members of the Guardian Council. Later on, when we specifically talk about the Guardian Council, you will see that it is composed of 12 members, 6 of them clerics and 6 lay jurists. What the chief of, or the head of the judiciary does is to nominate the 6 lay members to the Guardian Council. However, those nominations are subject to approval of the Majlis or the Parliament. Now, beginning with President Khatami's presidency in 1997, the hardliners in the government began using the judiciary as their main instrument, as their main weapon in launching their backlash against Khatami to undermine his reform agenda. And what they did essentially was to use the judiciary to imprison reformist leaders and to arrest and imprison journalists and close down many reformist papers. So the judiciary has been and continues to be behind nearly all of Iran's human rights violations, especially the jailing of journalists. And in one sense, this is truly an ironic development, because the institutions that are charged with the mission of ensuring justice has become the chief perpetrator of injustices against journalists and freedom of expression in Islamic Republic. Next is the Guardian Council that we discussed, and the Guardian Council is by far one of the most influential bodies in the government. Almost since its inception, it has been under the control of the conservative elements among the ruling elites and increasingly under the hardliners. As I mentioned earlier, the Guardian Council consists of 12 members, 6 theologians, and these 6 theologians are appointed by the leader, by the supreme leader, and then the 6 lay jurists, the remaining 6 of the 12 members, are, if you recall, are nominated by the judiciary subject to the approval of the parliament. Now remember, the head of the judiciary is also appointed by the leader. So therefore, the leader has a direct control over 6 of those members and an indirect control through the judiciary head for the other 6 lay members. The members of the Guardian Council serve 6-year staggered terms, so that means half of the membership changes every 3 years. Now let's talk a little bit about the powers of the Guardian Council. On the one hand, it is almost like the Supreme Court of the United States in that it is vested with the power to interpret the law passed by the Majlis and then interpret the Constitution and determine the compatibility of that law with both the Constitutions as well as, and this is an added element to the Supreme Court analogy, as well as its compatibility with Islamic laws or Sharia. Therefore, the Guardian Council has an effective veto power over all legislation. Laws that are found, so you can see the arrow from Guardian Council going to the Parliament, laws that are found to be incompatible with the Sharia are sent back to the Parliament to be revised and made compatible. To give you an idea, during the first Majlis or Parliament, over 1/3 of the legislations that was passed by the Parliament were judged by the Guardian Council as un-Islamic, and therefore they were sent back for revision. Second, the Council has exceptionally broad vetting powers. All candidates in all elections, whether they're for the Parliament, whether they're for the presidency, or for another organ that later I will discuss, the Assembly of Experts, they all must first be vetted and approved by the Guardian Council in order to be eligible to participate in election. Basically, the Council is empowered to review all candidates for presidency and Parliament and other elected offices and decide whether they're fit to serve in those positions. So a major area of factional conflict among the governing elites relates to this vetting power of the Guardian Council. Since the late 1990s, the Council has acted quite aggressively, disqualifying scores of candidates which it deemed unfit to serve. This has happened despite the fact that many of the rejected candidates were judged to be fit in the earlier election. So you're fit one day and unfit the next election. So you can see the political elements in here. It's the Islamic part of it is used as a cover to eliminate from competition the people whose ideology you disagree with. In 1997 election, for example, there were 226 candidates that vied for the presidency. Only 4 out of 226 were judge qualified. The reformist faction under President Khatami, who was Iran's president from 1997 to 1995, actually made an attempt to reduce the Council's vetting power, but at the end it failed in its effort. The next organ is the Expediency Discernment Council. In Farsi, this is called Maslahat, which literally means public interest. The term expediency for American audience sounds kind of crude and not very politically correct. But what it means here is what is in the best interest of the country. What type of policy best serves the interest of Islam and interest of the country. The council was originally intended as an advisory body to the leader. And as you may recall from earlier segments where I discussed this, with the launching of the so-called dual leadership in 1989 by President Rafsanjani and the leader Khamenei, the power of the Expediency Council was significantly broadened, and it went well beyond what Ayatollah Khomeini originally had intended. In fact, Ayatollah Khomeini specifically proscribed, he forbid the council to become a power alongside the other three branches. In fact, that's exactly what it has done. It has become not only alongside the other branches, it's really over and above the other three branches. So the two individuals, Rafsanjani and leader, invested the council with the authority to determine major policies of the Islamic Republic. In other words, the body became at once a kind of a Supreme Court as well as a rump parliament. So what exactly does the Expediency Council does and what gives it a lot of power? The council today has the ultimate adjudication power in disputes involving the Council of the Guardians or the Guardian Councils and the Parliament. Remember, the Guardian Council can reject a law passed by the Parliament as un-Islamic, and the Parliament must revise it. If the two cannot agree, then it goes to the Expediency Council. So the job of the Expediency Council becomes one of mediating and adjudicating disputes between the ruling clerics in the Guardian Council and the elected lawmakers in the Parliament. The Supreme Leader appoints its members who are prominent religious, social, and political figures. And at the present, the chairman is former President Hashemi Rafsanjani. Under Rafsanjani, the council has turned into a very influential strategic planning body and policy-making body. And based on that, the power of the Expediency Council has tremendously increased. You may recall that I also mentioned that the Expediency Council's role was augmented well beyond what Ayatollah Khomeini had intended. A good example of this was in October of 2005 when the leader gave the Expediency Council supervisory power over all three branches of government. In fact, over all branches of government. In other words, instead of not being alongside of it, the Expediency Council has been placed above it. And also the leader delegated some of his own authority to the council as permitted by the Constitution. In other words, it's unclear exactly how much of this supervisory power that was delegated to the council has been fully utilized, but all of that indicates that the Expediency Council has become far more important than the advisory body that Ayatollah Khomeini had envisioned. In sum, the Expediency Council has emerged as yet another clerically dominated, very powerful governmental institution, dwarfing the civilian institutions in the government. Next, I want to talk about the leader who we have been mentioning throughout this talk. The leader is chosen by clerics who make up the assembly of experts, which I mentioned we're going to discuss this body in the next slide. The role of the Supreme Leader in the Constitution was derived from the thinking of Ayatollah Khomeini. And based on that thinking, the leader was positioned at the very top of Iran's political power structure and hierarchy. Since the founding of the Islamic Republic, Iran has had two leaders, the first being Ayatollah Khomeini, and of course the second, the present leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. I know they sound very similar, but the two names are different, clearly, among Iranians at least. The leader has been granted very broad appointive and dismissal powers in terms of appointing officials and dismissing them, both in the elected and appointed segments of the government. The leader, for example, can dismiss an elected president in case he's found guilty either by the Supreme Court or through impeachment by the parliament. And we have had the case in which Ayatollah Khomeini, as the leader, dismissed Iran's first president, Bani Sadr. So this is the first area of influence. You can see the arrow going from the leader to the president. The leader also has indirect influence over the Majlis or the parliament. So I've used the dotted line to depict that. This influence is really mostly because of the leader's control over the Guardian Council, the way the Guardian Council's membership is made up. And remember, the leader appoints the 6 clerics, and the other 6 members are appointed by the judiciary, who is in turn appointed by the leader. The other thing is that the leader appoints the members of the very powerful Expediency Council as well. And we already talked about the head of the judiciary being appointed by the leader, and this proves to be a very important power because of the judiciary's control of nomination for 6 of the lay jurists in the Guardian Council. However, as I mentioned, the Majlis still has to approve it. And then the other thing the leader does is the Supreme National Security Council is under the leader, and this was yet another governmental organ that was created under the dual leadership in 1989 through revision of the Constitution. This body, the Supreme National Security Council, is a policy-making and policy coordinating body focusing on foreign policy, on intelligence and defense and security matters. The President presides over the Supreme National Security Council, and the Council is charged with formulating Iran's defense, national security policies. The membership of the Council includes the top officials that are involved in foreign policy and defense ministries, as well as all the concerned ministers and agencies, or the heads of agencies dealing with defense, security, foreign policy, intelligence matters. The body also is one that is charged with outlining Iran's nuclear program policies. The leader must confirm those policies. Even if they propose it, still the leader must confirm those policies, and in that way the leader has the ultimate approval for any of this. Finally, in this setup, the leader is the commander-in-chief of all the armed forces. These armed forces include, first and foremost, the Revolutionary Guards as well as the regular forces. But let's briefly talk about the Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards, I mentioned inter alia in the previous segment, was formed after the revolution with the idea of having a Praetorian Guard to protect the new leaders, the elites, and Islamic institutions. The next slide is an attempt to portray the elected portion of the Iranian governmental structure versus the unelected one. So that's going to be my main goal. So under the elected portion, we begin with the electorate. Iran has a population of approximately 75 million, out of which some 47 million are eligible to vote. The voting age used to be around 15, but after the 2005 election, when Ahmadinejad realized that the youth were not really supportive of him, The voting age was changed in January of 2007. It was raised to 18. Almost a third of the population in Iran has been born after the revolution. So really they have no memory of the pre-revolutionary Iran. The urban youth and women really represent the main group, that is the swing group. If they participate, of course the turnout's going to go way up, and they could swing the election in one way or the other if the election is held in a fair and legitimate way. If you recall, the youth and the women were also very instrumental in the victory of the reformist president Muhammad Khatami in his 2 elections. Then the dotted line that I have used here is to underscore the fact that none of the elections in the Islamic Republic are truly open and free election. So what that means is that essentially these elections are vetted and limited to approved candidates. The candidates are vetted, as I mentioned, by the Guardian Council, and they're the one who determine whether they're eligible to run, and the president therefore becomes an elected office in that kind of a truncated election, and so is the Majlis or the parliament. And then finally, the one that I mentioned several times before, the Assembly of Experts is also an elected office. So I want to talk a little bit about the Assembly of Experts. It consists of 86 theologian clerics. Its members are directly elected by the electorate, so it gives the the appearance of a direct election. However, only clerics can join the assembly, and the candidates for those elections first must be vetted by the Guardian Council. These members are elected for an 8-year term. Their main responsibility is to appoint the supreme leader and also to monitor and oversee his performance. And in case the assembly judges the leader to be incapable of fulfilling his duties and responsibilities, they have the power to remove him. The assembly usually holds 2 sessions per year, and it remains dominated today by conservative, hardline clerics. Then comes the supreme leader, who is elected by the Assembly of Experts. The position that I have placed the leader is somewhere straddling the elected versus the non-elected institution, because his election is all subject to all kinds of vetting and certain qualifications only by theologians. And in that sense, the leader would straddle the 2 institutions. And the next arrow is to show that the influence is in terms of appointment or approval. So you have the Expediency Council, which we already discussed. Under the leader, you have the Guardian Council, also under the leader, and then you have this vetting, which is exercised by the Guardian Council. So entire election process has to be mediated by this vetting process exercised by the Guardian Council. And as we mentioned, the head of the judiciary is also chosen by the leader. And the line here talks about the partial appointment, and you can see that in terms of partial appointment, the parliament has partial appointment powers over 6 of the 12 members in the Guardian Council nominated by the head of the judiciary. The parliament has to approve those. And we also talked about the Supreme National Security Council that is also under the leader. And of course, the armed forces are under the leader. Finally, there is this dotted line going from the president to the Supreme National Security Council because the president presides over the Supreme National Security Council. So the dotted line from the president goes to the Supreme National Security Council, in which the president presides. So you can see this is a very complex and deliberately manipulated system of checks by the clerics with very little balancing by the civilian institution that at the end ensures the unelected and the religious institutions dominate the elected, partially elected I should say, and civil institution. And that's the structure of this unique phenomena we call the Islamic Republic of Iran, the government of Islamic Republic of Iran.